Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
And now, the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to the Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Monday, December 29th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of the Federal Drive, when the U.S. stops tracking global air quality, the world feels it. Plus, a hidden DoD lab sounds like a cyber thriller, but its real mission is shaping the future of digital investigations. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of the Federal Drive. We begin with this. The Department of Homeland Security's year was marked by high-profile immigration enforcement operations and turbulence behind the scenes. DHS also received a historic influx of new funding under the Tax and Reconciliation Bill passed by Congress in July. But the department faces some big management challenges as it prepares for a consequential year ahead. Justin Doubleday joins me now for more on DHS's year in review. Justin, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Terry.
All right. In 500 words or less, what were some of the biggest changes at DHS this year?
500 words. We'll see. Well, the change in administration was obviously the huge change for DHS. Border security and deportation operations have obviously been perhaps top priority of this administration. And Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem has been the face of those operations in many ways. And you've seen that trickle down to the management of the department. You look at staffing levels, DHS was one of the few federal agencies that actually increased its staff this year. Most other departments went the other way. But those increases are largely concentrated at places like Customs and Border Protection, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and the Coast Guard. Other components, like the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, have seen relatively big staffing departures, and we can talk a little bit more about that later. But suffice to say, there's been a huge change in priority at DHS over the last year.
Secretary Noem, as you say, has certainly been the face of the department. How has she run it? Is she doing things differently than her predecessors?
She certainly is. And I think one of the big things to look at that kind of exemplifies this change is the fact that she is really kind of controlling all of the big spending that happens at what is a very large department that spends a lot of money. In June, Noem signed out a new policy that she must review and sign off on all contracts and awards over $100,000. Our colleague Jason Miller broke that story, actually, and he crunched the numbers at the time. In 2024, DHS had 11,597 awards over $100,000, just a significant amount of awards that would fall under that policy. We've heard from contractors that they've seen, expected awards delayed significantly. We've heard from federal employees that they've seen delays in their programs and, contractor support falling off for their programs. There's been a prioritization, clearly, in certain areas, in the wake of the Texas flooding over the summer. FEMA spending got out the door really quickly. DHS recently released a request for proposals for a counter-UAS contract that could be worth up to $1.5 billion. So there's definitely some priorities there. But one source familiar with how this process is working told me that, the backlog of DHS contracts has built up at certain points to roughly 5,000 awards that are waiting for Noem's approval. DHS's position on this is that Noem is, saving taxpayer money and making sure the department is appropriately spending that money. She actually appeared at a recent industry conference and said she has personally reviewed more than 9,000 contracts. She said that the DHS has, her review process has saved the department more than $13 billion. These are very difficult numbers to independently verify. That is a remarkable amount of contracts for a cabinet member at her level to review. She has an incredibly busy schedule and is often traveling. What is clear is that Noem and her team are committed to this process for the time being, and that's something that industry has had to adjust to.
That's something we've been watching in a lot of different ways. You mentioned also the department is so big. It's a composite of a dozen or more separate agencies. Which of those components saw the biggest changes this year?
Well, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency is one. CISA was kind of an early target of this administration and Secretary Noem. They have criticized the agency in the past for what they call censorship, and they're referring to CISA's disinformation activities surrounding the 2020 elections, surrounding the COVID-19 pandemic, some other issues. CISA had all but ceased those activities by last year because they had received some criticism, and the staff who worked on those issues amounted to less than 36 employees. And CISA has shed far more staff this year. More than 1,000 employees have left the agency through voluntary programs and some terminations. That's roughly 1/3 of the staff that CISA had at the start of the year. Like many DHS components, CISA has also had a lot of uncertainty around its leadership. Many senior CISA executives were among those who departed the agency in late spring. And Sean Planke has been nominated to serve as CISA director. He's a widely respected cybersecurity leader, but his nomination is being held up in the Senate over various issues. One CISA employee who asked to remain anonymous, who remains at the agency, told me it's just been an extremely difficult year.
Cyber defense remains a hot topic, in national discussions and international discussions. Where did the CISA mission go?
Well, in the words of the administration and folks like Secretary Noem, they say that they've been more targeted and kind of sharpened CISA's mission, done away with things, not just kind of the disinformation efforts, but also some other divisions have been collapsed within CISA, things like bombing prevention and things like that. And they say they want CISA to be purely focused on cybersecurity and infrastructure security, the cybersecurity of federal networks, the cybersecurity of critical infrastructure networks. And that's really where they've been mostly focused. You've seen a lot of their products, though, the guidance and things like that, slow down. It picked back up this year when they got some new political leaders in. But you've seen a lot of the guidance that CISA normally churns out on a weekly basis really slow down for quite a while. And it's only recently picked back up. And employees tell me that they're still waiting on a lot of things to get out the door because there's just been all these changes.
One of the other agencies at DHS that's gotten a lot of attention is the Federal Emergency Management Agency. What's the year been like at FEMA?
Well, similar to CISA, FEMA was kind of on the early target list of this administration. President Trump actually said within his first few days in office that they would get rid of FEMA and go to something else. And while administration officials have mostly backed off that type of rhetoric, they still appear to be angling to downsize the agency and shift more responsibility to state and local governments. FEMA has also shed a lot of staff. There was a Government Accountability Office report that came out earlier this fall. The number of active FEMA employees decreased from 25,800 to about 23,350, so about 2,500 employees over the course of the spring. That includes a lot of career staff who work up at FEMA headquarters. It includes 24 senior executives who departed the agency. So again, a lot of seasoned people, a lot of seasoned staff left FEMA this year. And the agency has had 3 separate acting leaders, none of whom have the extensive emergency management experience that a FEMA administrator typically has. Trump has not nominated anyone to serve as a permanent FEMA administrator, and we're still awaiting the recommendations of the FEMA Review Council. Those recommendations are expected to serve as a blueprint for this administration's plan for FEMA, but the council's recommendations were set to be voted on last week. The White House unexpectedly and at the last minute delayed that vote to whenever we will see next.
With all of those changes, DHS still got a huge amount of new money in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. What are they spending that money on, and where are they in terms of implementing those programs?
Well, the bill included $165 billion in additional funding for DHS through 2029. That is largely centered on ICE, CBP, and the Coast Guard. And it has to, essentially, it's aimed largely at immigration enforcement and border security. You have $45 billion for new immigration detention centers, $50 billion for the border wall and border security technologies. $8 billion to hire 10,000 new ICE officers and $4 billion for CBP to hire 8,000 new agents. So a lot of spending on hard facilities, on technology, and on hiring. It's still very early in DHS actually spending this money. They haven't gotten a lot out the door. They were hoping to spend roughly $40 billion through the end of fiscal 2026 from that bill. So we will see if they hit that mark, but there's still a lot of money coming down the pipeline. Deputy Assistant Commissioner for the Office of Acquisition at CBP, Earl Lewis, spoke at a recent industry conference just about the challenge of moving quickly with this amount of new funding.
We're trying to do competitive. We're trying to do things fast, limited resources. But I believe you have to have oversight in real time. You do not want to wait until the end. Unfortunately, that means that you have to balance allowing your folks to go and run, but then maybe slowing them down a little bit to think, to ask those questions, to make sure they have the proper guidance, to make sure they're working with legal, to make sure they looked at policy, to talk through things like that. Those are the types of challenges that when I think of OB3, how do you provide enough oversight without slowing the process down?
With all these changes at DHS in 2025, Justin, what are you watching for coming into 2026?
Definitely the confirmation and selection of senior leaders at the department. One thing to mention here recently is that Deputy Secretary Troy Edgar is now on his way out after less than a year on the job. He's been nominated to be the ambassador to El Salvador. He has extensive management experience at DHS from the first Trump administration, and before that, his departure leaves a major hole at DHS when it is, spending all this money through the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, when it lacks already a lot of senior confirmed leaders. So who will replace Troy Edgar? Who will fill other jobs at DHS headquarters and throughout many of the components? It just remains to be seen. Another big thing, the issuance of the FEMA Review Council's report. That was expected, as I mentioned earlier this month, and now we're not quite sure when that might happen, but that is going to lay out conceivably the administration's long-term vision for FEMA, and that's been an open question here. So that's a big one. And as we just talked about, the implementation of OB3, as it's being called, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, how DHS, effectively hires thousands of new officers, how it spends funding on everything from border security technologies to Coast Guard ships. It's a huge bill. It's a huge task without a lot of senior leadership confirmed in place. How is Secretary Noem and the current department leadership going to handle that?
That's Federal News Network's Justin Doubleday. Justin, thanks so much for this deep dive.
Thank you, Terry.
You can find Justin's story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, a hidden DoD lab sounds like a cyber thriller, but its real mission is shaping the future of digital investigations. This is The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Few people outside the Pentagon know about the DoD Cybercrime Center's Cyber Forensics Lab, but its work underpins DoD criminal investigations, major defense contractor cases, and even DOJ prosecutions. Today, we'll uncover how this team's cutting-edge capabilities strengthen national security and redefine what's possible in digital forensics with the lab's director, Kevin Rivera. Mr. Rivera, great to have you with us this morning.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
You have a very cool job title. You are the director of the DC-3 Cyber Forensics Lab, the DoD Cybercrime Center. Most people probably don't even know that kind of function exists, much less what you do. So I want to give you an opportunity to do that first. Tell us about the lab and its mission.
Sure. Thank you. So the Cyber Forensics Lab has existed for already about 27 years. I totally agree with you. I think many across the DoD don't even know that we exist. We've been serving for the last 27 years the Department of Defense, primarily the Defense Criminal Investigative Organizations, in support of their investigations of crimes either against or committed by members of the Department of Defense or somehow affecting the Department of Defense. We do digital forensics of digital media related to those crimes. So when crimes occur and they're investigated, the investigators conduct crime scene searches, they seize evidence. That evidence often is digital evidence in the form of mobile devices, tablets, computers, laptops, gaming systems, etc. And those evidence items have artifacts of relevance to those crimes very often. Our job is to look at those devices and find the artifacts that are related to the criminal activity and either support or refute the allegations against those individuals.
It sounds very much like what we might see in a TV show. What are some of the more interesting cases that you've been involved in?
Some of the more interesting cases, I think one very recent instance, one of our specialties is recovering data off of damaged media or media that stops working properly. We have the expertise and specialized skill sets here with our subject matter experts that are able to troubleshoot those broken or failing devices, determine what about them has failed, repair or replace those failing parts, and get those items back to functioning so that we can pull the data off of them and then analyze it. A customer recently came to us with a server that was eight drives that comprised about 800 terabytes of data. 40 terabytes of that data was critical to that organization, and the server had failed. So they came to us not knowing who else they could turn to recover that critical data that was not replaceable. Long story short, within about 3 weeks' time of troubleshooting and a collaborative team effort here at the Cyber Forensics Lab, we were able to troubleshoot, identify, and replace the failed parts, get those hard drives back to working condition, and then recover and reconstruct that data and return it to the customer.
So that sounds like a case where it wasn't a crime, it was just a failure of hardware. So you're tackling both hardware failures and also malware or cybercrime or other sorts of things I'm not even sure I could imagine.
That's correct. We also support the Defense Industrial Base and the Department of Defense from a cybersecurity perspective. We do malware analysis, malware reverse engineering, cyber intrusion forensics to identify if an intrusion has taken place. If it has, identify for the investigative agencies where that attack came from, how that computer, the initial computer or point of entry was compromised, and help them further those investigations to bring justice to the offenders.
I'm speaking with Kevin Rivera. He's the director of the DC3 Cyber Forensics Lab. You mentioned that the lab's been in existence now almost 30 years. I would imagine you've seen quite a difference in mission and problem sets from when you began to where you're operating at today. What are the most significant changes in that time frame?
The most prolific change that I've seen in the almost 20 years that I personally have been here at the Cyber Forensics Lab, back in the early 2000s, we were investigating and analyzing computer hard drives. Nowadays, in 2025, almost 2026, every person essentially in America that's walking around is walking around with a computer in their pocket. Most of us call them our cell phones. And every one of those devices has just an enormous volume of data. And that's just one device that almost every person has. Many people also have laptops and computers, and they're moving around and conducting digital activities across a variety of different devices. And so the investigations into those devices and to find the artifacts of relevance has become increasingly complex as we have to correlate activity between multiple devices for a single offender and attribute how the offender is obtaining the data, whether it's child sexual assault material or whether it's artifacts related to a conspiracy to hurt somebody, or you name it, anything that you can imagine. We've probably seen it here at the Cyber Forensics Lab, and the complexity and the volume of data just continues to explode on orders of magnitude.
You mentioned also the technology challenges. I would imagine that the forensics mission has got to evolve as quickly as technology does. And these days, of course, if we insert AI into that equation, it gets even more complicated. What would you say are the toughest technology challenges that your team faces today?
I think one of the most difficult challenges that we face is the encryption of digital data. The encryption is becoming increasingly complex. Apps are exploding onto the scene of availability, again, on orders of magnitude, and the number of apps that are available to folks. Where offenders are looking to conceal their activities, they never run out of creativity in how they might go about that. And there's always more and more apps exploding onto the scene that make that possible for them to try to conceal the things that they're doing and make it hard for the eventual would-be investigator to uncover what they've been doing by analyzing those devices. So the encryption of those apps and the data in those apps, I think, is probably the most challenging issue that we face.
And you mentioned also that you work not only across the service lines there within DoD, but you work across agencies. You support DOJ investigations. You also work with the Defense Industrial Base. How complex are all of those collaborations, and how do you integrate operations across those various facets?
It's very challenging, I will say. When we're working, when we're supporting an intrusion investigation that's affected the Defense Industrial Base, we're often working not necessarily collaboratively, but in parallel with probably a commercial incident response firm that's working for, that's essentially a hired gun by the corporation that's been compromised to come in and try to protect the integrity and reputation of that company, because as we know, major defense contractors that are compromised, that's a blemish on their record as far as a contractor that's appealing for the department to work with. Because as the department, we value the privacy of our information. It's important for us for national security to be able to protect and keep that information safe.
We hear every day about cyber threats. I can't imagine there are very many slow days for you there at the lab. But as you look forward, are there upcoming initiatives or new technologies maybe that you're looking forward to that will help shape the digital investigation field?
I think a field that everyone across the DoD is trying to lean into is learning how to understand and analyze the artifacts associated with critical infrastructure, because that's one of our nation's biggest points of vulnerability. It spreads across a variety of industry sectors, and the hardware that's in use in those infrastructures is such a wide range of hardware that's got proprietary software running on it, computers that are 25 years old that they can't update because it would break something and cause something to stop working properly. And the vulnerability that exists across that range of territory is astronomical.
And you're looking at the pieces after an attack or an event has already happened. What do you wish people knew on the front end that could protect themselves, their devices, and their information from cyber threat?
I think that the old adage of be careful what you click on is probably the most predominant offering suggestion that I could give to anybody. Spear phishing and spam, we see it all the time and we take it for granted, but it really presents a great risk to the everyday user. Clicking on those links, because of what we do now with our digital devices, and so many of us are doing mobile banking and interacting with the Social Security Administration and all these different things that we take for granted that we're putting out there by way of doing that. The possibility that somebody could compromise our device and steal our identity very, very easily.
I've been speaking with Kevin Rivera. He's the director of the DC3 Cyber Forensics Lab. Thank you so much for joining me, and thanks for this important work.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your time.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, an FBI practice meant to safeguard national security was quietly set aside for top leaders. But first, when the U.S. stops tracking global air quality, the world feels it. You're listening to The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. The State Department's Global Air Monitoring Program gave diplomats and citizens abroad real-time data on air pollution and drove transparency worldwide. Its shutdown leaves a gap with serious health and economic consequences. We'll explore what's at stake and what it would take to restore the program with retired Foreign Service Officer Tara Vose. Tara, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
You've written recently about probably a little-known program at the U.S. Department of State, the Global Air Monitoring Program. Tell us about that and why it's so important.
The Global Air Monitoring Program actually started as a single monitor in Beijing, China in the early 2000s. As you can imagine, or maybe you can't if you haven't actually been there, some days the air pollution in Beijing in particular, but in multiple megacities of China, was so bad you could not see across the street. It was like living in a cartoon. You thought that you could take a knife and cut a circle out through that pollution. Unfortunately, at that time, we only had the Chinese government data to go by for how polluted it really was. And what we were seeing was that the air was rated as a quote-unquote blue sky day. And that was the Chinese standard for a good air quality day. And we thought, how can this be possible? I can't see across the street, but yet you're telling me it's only maybe mildly polluted or it is a blue sky day. It was one of those situations where the facts on the ground just did not match what was being told. So we thought, well, let's see if this is right. And one of my colleagues started analyzing the data that was being produced by the Chinese government and found that air monitors were being selectively turned off at times when their ratings were getting too high. And that's how they were maintaining this blue sky day average, which was not correct. So knowing that this data was incorrect, we had to take steps to find out what the air quality really was. And we ordered a small, actually handheld monitor to begin with. That was the very first one. And it was set up outside somebody's window at the embassy. And its readings showed what we knew to be true, that the air was in fact hazardous or very unhealthy by US EPA standards.
How did the program evolve then from that single incident to a worldwide program?
So we continued with that. We bought a larger, single monitor, a Met-1 BAM, and placed that on the roof of the embassy and started to take official readings. And we realized we cannot keep this information to ourselves. According to U.S. law, we have a no double standard policy, which means if the U.S. government knows of information that could be harmful to U.S. citizens, we need to share that information. So therefore, we started putting that information out on a Twitter feed with the basic information of what the air quality was. Then the Chinese authorities started complaining, obviously, because it did not match their data. We called in the EPA to make sure that we were doing everything correctly. Turns out we were. And we honed our data to match exactly with EPA standards. And I don't mean by manipulating the data, but by reporting it according to EPA standards. And then everybody just gobbled up this information, the Chinese public, everybody else. And from there, other posts started calling us, other embassies saying, gosh, the folks in New Delhi called and they're like, we have terrible air pollution here too. How do we do this? And we said, okay, well, here's what you need to do. You need to make sure you're working with the EPA. Make sure that you have, this and this and this criteria all set up. And it just mushroomed from there. And everywhere that we ended up putting that monitor, everybody in the countries was happy with it.
So the program originally had a focus on protecting the health of U.S. citizens in foreign cities,
yes,
and took on a more global aspect. Tell us about really the impact of having U.S. presented pollution numbers in these foreign cities.
Well, it was fascinating, at least in China to start with, because we were actually, when we started presenting the data, the Chinese authorities claimed that we were breaking international covenants and releasing insider data, essentially. And we realized this is not true, and we pushed back within the government itself. And it turned out, now this is an interesting little bit of Chinese insider play here, that the Chinese environmental authorities were actually on our side. They wanted us to present that data because they wanted stronger laws, and they also, frankly, wanted more money so they could enforce their existing laws. But there was a break between where the federal environmental agency had authority and where the local provinces did. And local provinces, unfortunately, and their governors tended to have a little too much leeway and ability to manipulate data as needed. But by siding with the federal authority, we were actually able to make them more powerful and to result in more accurate, transparent information throughout China. So that is exactly the type of effect that this had throughout multiple countries. Now, sometimes we're dealing with, former communist USSR type countries like Kazakhstan. Other times we're dealing with, monarchies like Thailand. But it didn't matter. They knew that our data was legitimate, that it could be trusted, and they wanted to learn how to do it. So by us expanding this, not only were they interested in U.S. technologies and U.S. sciences on how to do it, but also how do we build public trust within our own institutions, so that it was pretty much warmly welcomed.
I'm speaking with Tara Vose. She's a retired Foreign Service officer. Well, Tara, it sounds like a no-brainer and a pretty low-cost program, but it was terminated earlier this year. Can you tell us about the logic behind that?
Unfortunately, I cannot tell you the logic behind turning off this program. I remember receiving the notice that this program was going to be turned off in the spring of this year, and it was devastating to me. What was said was that the program was too expensive to operate. However, anywhere that the program was already operating, you had the sunk costs of the monitor already installed. You had minimal maintenance fees for the monitor, and publishing the data on the internet is pennies. So I am not quite sure what or where the decision came from for this.
What would it take to restart the program? Maybe it doesn't matter in cities where they've taken on this responsibility, but there are lots of embassies and lots of places that may not have started their own monitoring problem. What would it take to restart it?
That's a very good question, and it all depends, I suppose, on exactly how you want to approach it. It's true that there are places that have graduated off of our monitoring system, and we could argue that China, they have adjusted their laws and they are accurately producing that information. But there are so many embassies out there, so many countries that do not have the resources for this, but yet still have bad air pollution. Some ideas that I can come up with off the top of my head are those monitors that are no longer being used at certain embassies could be shipped to others, so then you have no additional costs other than shipping. That turning on the system again to cooperate with EPA and feed in, that's almost like flipping a switch. I don't want to upset all of my IT friends on that, but it's really quite simple.
We do still have a responsibility to our own citizens in those cities to provide health-related pollution information, I would assume.
We do, and it's also an excellent heads-up type of information for us here in the U.S. As we know, air pollution has no borders. We've seen the smoke come over from wildfires in Canada. We need monitors within our own country and other countries to know what's coming. And it's not just air pollution as well. The Met 1 BAM is only for PM 2.5 monitoring, but it's so easy to monitor any other pollutant as needed, including mercury or other contaminants. I mean, about 30% of the mercury that is in U.S. waters comes from Asia. So we really need to keep an eye on these things. It affects the homeland.
I've been speaking with Tara Vose. She's a retired Foreign Service officer. Tara, you certainly make a powerful case for this. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up next, an FBI practice meant to safeguard national security was quietly set aside for top leaders. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. New reporting shows FBI Director Kash Patel granted polygraph waivers to Deputy Director Dan Bongino and 2 senior aides. That's an unprecedented step in the Bureau's clearance process. William Turton of ProPublica is here to explain what that decision means for vetting standards and oversight. Mr. Turton, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
You've done an interesting report recently. You revealed that senior officials at the FBI were granted waivers for polygraph exams. Let's start at the beginning, really. Is this normal? And if it's not, what is normal?
It's not normal. You know, the people we spoke to who've worked at the highest levels of the FBI have told us that to grant waivers for people like the Deputy Director Dan Bongino, the Congressional Liaison Marshall Yates, and the Executive Assistant to the Director, Kash Patel, a woman named Nicole Rucker, granting them polygraph waivers is unprecedented. We spoke to one person who said that they could only recall one waiver being granted to an outside expert, and that was the only one they knew of in about a 7-year period.
Are senior leaders at the FBI normally required to pass a polygraph exam?
All FBI employees are required to pass a polygraph exam, and that's been the case since 1994. So just to become an FBI employee, you must pass a polygraph. And then as you gain more clearances or access to more sensitive information, some employees have to pass multiple polygraphs.
And what does a waiver then of the polygraph signify?
It's a good question. We would love to know more about why they were granted waivers. When you take a polygraph at the Bureau, based on the people that we spoke to, you get asked all sorts of questions ranging from, illegal drug use to foreign contacts. And, anything in the spectrum there can potentially cause issues with your employment. We didn't report any details as to why these people were granted waivers, but we'd love to know more.
So who has the authority then to grant the waiver?
We reported that Kash Patel, the director of the FBI, granted the waivers to all 3 of the employees that I mentioned earlier.
Is there any requirement to give a justification for that, or was there any transparency around why those waivers were provided?
So the Bureau didn't disclose that the waivers were granted. The only reason we know that is because, we spoke to sources with knowledge and we ended up reporting it. But there was no sort of disclosure or justification from the Bureau as to why the waivers were granted. When we went to the Bureau for comment, one of the things that they told us was that, these employees are Schedule C political appointees, so therefore they don't have to take a polygraph. We spoke to 4 experts who specialize in security clearances and polygraphs who told us that's not true. Being a Schedule C or political appointee doesn't preclude you from having to take a polygraph. And, for the record, I went and checked the plum book. Only one of the 3 employees that I previously mentioned, Nicole Rucker, is listed as a political appointee.
One of the reasons that you might expect an FBI official to take a polygraph is to make sure there isn't any compromising information in their background. But one of the other reasons is to secure that top secret clearance. What kind of information might these folks be exposed to? And what is the impact of not having a clear polygraph test and clearance?
So, as we reported in this story, the Deputy Director of the FBI received some of the most closely guarded secrets that the American government has to offer. People have told us that the Deputy Director would routinely receive the President's daily brief, which is sort of a, summary from all across the intelligence community of some of the most pressing threats to the country. And they also get access to SCI, or special compartmented information, where people are read in and read out of various programs where a very small amount of people have knowledge that program. There's also secure spaces within FBI headquarters. For example, on the 7th floor where the director of the FBI works, the entire director's suite is what's known as a SCIF, or secure compartmented information facility, meaning it's designed to protect against electronic eavesdropping. You can't bring personal devices inside, and you need clearance that is, granted in part by passing your polygraph to access those spaces.
I'm speaking with William Gerton. He's an investigative reporter with ProPublica. So what does all of this mean in terms of national security and public trust? If these folks don't have the proper clearances or haven't been properly vetted and have access to these important secret information?
It's an interesting question. I think one of the most immediate impacts that this has could be on the morale of other FBI employees. It's important to note that Mr. Patel, the director of the FBI, has used the polygraph on his own workforce in order to see if negative comments have been made about him personally, or if there have been leaks to the media. And so I think it presents a sort of immediate double standard that hasn't really been explained by the Bureau, where, top officials close to Patel don't have to take a polygraph, where at the same time, Patel will use the polygraph to try and ferret out leaks or negative comments about his leadership.
What's happening in terms of oversight here? Has the Department of Justice said anything, or the congressional oversight committees?
So Senator Durbin, who is the ranking member of the Senate Judiciary Committee, which is the main congressional oversight body of the FBI, raised this issue before Kash Patel when he testified before Congress. This actually happened before our story published, but Durbin mentioned, senior members of Patel's staff and didn't at that time explicitly name the deputy director. So, this is on Congress's radar. And when Kash Patel was asked about this, he didn't engage in the question directly and deflected.
So this feels a little bit like a tree falling in the forest. If no one is there to hear it, does it make a sound? Is this really a big deal? And if it is, what is going to happen in terms of broader implications, policy changes, or even maybe a shakeup?
The former senior FBI officials and other government officials we spoke to thought it was a big deal. They thought it was a reflection of the fact that the FBI is being run by people who wouldn't be able to, in their view, pass the minimum requirements to become an agent, much less the deputy director. So I think there's a question of security, absolutely, people are concerned about. There's a question about, keeping information confidential and secure. And then, there's open questions about the motivations of the people running the Bureau. Officials that we spoke to wondered whether this was an example of prioritizing personal loyalty to the Trump administration and the director, rather than the kind of policies, procedures that are typically in place for FBI employees.
Have you heard anything from Senator Durbin or his staff or the committees about moving forward with additional hearings or additional oversight or possibly even future reforms of this process?
We haven't, really. I think this story got lost in the news a little bit. There's been a lot of news about the Bureau of late, and we haven't. But, I'm keeping my ears open. I think there's a lot more to this story, and I have a feeling that it's kind of just scratching the surface.
If it is eventually to generate some kind of reform, what do you think would be most likely? Would it be tightening clearance rules or codifying the polygraph requirements, as an example?
I'm not sure what avenues for reform there are, because as I understand it, the director and the president basically have unilateral authority to grant waivers for polygraphs or to grant, in some cases, clearances. So I don't think anyone is eager to change that level of authority that rests with the president or the director of the FBI.
Do you see any parallels between how the FBI has approached the polygraph and maybe what's happening in the Department of Defense?
I think the most obvious parallel to me in writing the story, I'm a little bit biased because I did some reporting on this earlier this year, but what was happening at DHS, where employees were regularly being polygraphed for questions about media leaks or, if employees had criticized leadership. It was kind of the exact same thing that we've been hearing at the FBI happening to rank and file staff.
I've been speaking with William Gerton. He's an investigative reporter with ProPublica. Thanks so much for sharing this story with us, and we'll see what happens.
Thanks for having me.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. 2025 has been a transformational year for the Defense Department. The Air Force scrapped most of its sweeping reoptimization initiative announced under previous leadership, while the Army undertook one of its most significant acquisition and organizational reform efforts in decades. Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis joins me now to highlight some of the biggest changes that happened across the Defense Department this year. Anastasia, great to have you.
Hi, Terry.
I think it would be impossible for us to cover all the things that happened in DoD over the past year, but why don't you start with some of the most significant? One that we just mentioned is the Air Force announcing it paused all of its efforts related to its sweeping reoptimization effort. Why did it decide to abandon so much of that program?
Yeah, well, the scope of the proposed changes under former Secretary Frank Kendall was enormous. At the time, Kendall said that it had become very clear to the entire senior leadership that the service was not well positioned for the great power competition, which is China, after spending more than 2 decades supporting the global war on terror. But once Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth was sworn in, he almost immediately halted all of those efforts. And in December, so very recently, Air Force Secretary Troy Mink announced that they would cancel more than half of its sweeping efforts. The reason for that is that he feared that some of those really big changes would be a little too disruptive. So, for example, there was an effort to create a new air-based wing organizational model. The secretary said those plans were canceled to minimize change fatigue to airmen. One change that I wanted to highlight was the Air Force's decision to cancel the Integrated Capabilities Command that would have overseen the service's requirements process. A provisional version of the command was already stood up that happened a year ago, but now the leadership decided that they will fold its functions into the Air Force futures. But some of the popular changes, like bringing back warrant officers, is here to stay.
That's good to know. And it sounds like some of those changes were just at the headquarters or higher level organizations and not in the fighting force.
Yeah, that is fair to say.
Well, Air Force has also been working with Space Force. What's going on with Space Force?
The Space Force will actually continue on with the key elements of the reoptimization efforts that were specific to the service. The leadership said that those efforts pretty much aligned with where they were heading.
Well, let's go to a different service then. Let's talk about the Marine Corps. They've been working on a force design initiative since 2020. What are some of the updates that they provided in that program for 2025?
Yeah, the Marine Corps is largely staying the course, although at the beginning of the year, Marine Corps Commandant General Eric Smith said that budget uncertainty could affect the service's ability to meet some of the critical milestones. A year ago, General Smith highlighted that they were standing up Marine littoral regiments. The 2025 updates that said that the Marine Corps continues to stand up those littoral regiments, and those are specialized units within the Marine Corps that are supposed to operate in contested coastal areas. At the same time, the Corps is extending many of the capabilities fielded within those regiments, like command and control systems, unmanned platforms, and advanced sensors across Marine expeditionary units. The Corps is also embracing the idea of managing the acquisition system as portfolio of capabilities rather than individual programs. One example is their new capability portfolio approach in Program Executive Officer Land Systems. But the debate around the force design is still ongoing, with critics saying that the concept is unproven. It only focuses on specific locations. It kind of weakens the Marine Corps as a combined arms force, and it also limits its ground ability.
Sounds like there's some pretty foundational philosophical disagreements that are underlying some of these changes. What about in the biggest service, the Army? It had a big year with its own transformation initiative. What are the most consequential changes that you see the Army making?
Yeah, absolutely. There was a lot that was announced in May when the service leadership rolled out the Army Transformation Initiative, and shifting away from managing individual programs to a portfolio-based structure is a big part of that transformation. They've been moving out on that. But as I was told, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth requiring the Army to include right to repair provisions in all new and existing contracts was possibly one of the most important lines in that entire memo that they released in May. Modifying existing contracts to fix IP issues would be extremely challenging for the service. But at the same time, they kind of have no choice. And it remains to be seen whether the Army's acquisition workforce is prepared and equipped to negotiate those kinds of provisions effectively within the existing contracts and within new contracts. At the same time, right to repair provisions had broad bipartisan support. They were included in both the Senate and House version of the 2026 Defense Policy Bill, but at the end, they were stripped from the final version of the legislation after industry pushback. So now that we don't have that, this is the opportunity for the Pentagon to exercise their existing authorities, but at the same time, without legislation enforcing that consistency, it's probably unlikely that contracting officers will be able to effectively implement those right to repair provisions across all these contracts effectively.
Anastasia, it sounds like the combination of acquisition reform and how it's playing out and unfinished business when it comes to force structure realignment is going to keep the department busy for 2026.
There is a lot that is going to unfold in 2026, a lot to watch for in 2026. But again, these are just some of the maybe biggest reforms that we highlight. There is so much more.
That's Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you, Terry.
You can find her full story at federalnewsnetwork.com. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Sandiford. Our web editors are Daisy Thornton and Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.